Man, we're going to dive into God's Word today together as we always do every week here at True North. I want to begin by just sharing a short story. A couple of years ago, we went to this barbecue place, Mission Barbecue. Not sure if anybody's ever been there before. And it was just Autumn and Logan and I. And I'm pretty sure it was the first time Logan had ever had ribs before. And so if you've ever eaten ribs before, you know, man, there's just sauce everywhere. And it's on your hands and it's on your face, right? And it's just, it's a mess, right? And so he's eating these ribs, and he's like 5 years old. I mean, he's got sauce all over him, right? And so I looked at him and I said, man, by the time this is done, you are gonna need a wet nap. And he looked back at me just with the most sweet, sincere, like honest, but like kind of like this kind of face, the dog turns its face is like, and says to me, why are you gonna get me all wet and make me take a nap when this is done, right? And I just remember that moment, right? He didn't understand what I was talking about. He had no context for that. His expectation when I said, you're going to need a wet nap, was I'm going to super soak him and make him take a nap, right? Why? What else would you think, right? He's never heard of a wet nap before, right? And so in that moment, man, it just makes me realize it's a reminder to me that so often expectations are unbelievably important, aren't they? Right? No matter what kind of stage of life you're at, no matter what the environment is, whether it's relationships, maybe it's in your job, maybe you're part of a sports team, right? Expectations are critical. And in that moment, what happened is that he was very confused, right? I would have been confused too if I had never heard about a wet nap, right? He was confused. The gap between what his expectation was and what I was actually trying to convey, something was lost in there, right? And we all know this. We've experienced it in our relationships especially. Like if there is that expectation gap, it can cause all kinds of problems, can it? And I believe this to my core. When it comes to our spiritual lives, right? Expectations between us and God are unbelievably important. Like so important. It's so important for us not only to understand who God is, but also who God has called us to be. Who he's called us to be. And if there's a gap there, it can present problems. It can present challenges, not just for us as individuals, but I think for us corporately as the church. And so we've been working through the Gospel of Mark now for the last couple of years, honestly. We're about a year and a half into this, and we've broken this down into seasons. We did Mark season 1, we did Mark season 2, we're now in Mark season 3. This is like week 9 or 10 of season 3. And as we are working through this gospel, what Jesus is doing over and over again with his disciples is he is laying down clear expectations about who he is, right? Jesus came into this world. He's God, but he came into this world, put on flesh. Why? Why did he do that? Because we are human beings. When we look at, it's just so much easier to understand Jesus. Right, he comes in this physical form. He's laying down the expectations for who God is and who he calls us to be as his followers and as his disciples. And today, as we continue working through the Gospel of Mark, we're in chapter 8. Jesus is going to draw a line in the sand like he has never done before with his disciples. And boy, is it a line in the sand that we need to understand as his church and as his people today. And so I am so excited about this message. I'm telling you right now, this is a convicting one. This is a challenging one, but it's also, I believe this, if we will understand this, really get this, what Jesus is trying to get us to understand, man, it is a life-transforming perspective that will also encourage you greatly. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 27, just picking back up where we left off. Last week, I would encourage you, if you're new or newer to True North and you aren't subscribed to our YouTube channel, you're not subscribed to our podcast, whichever way you kind of like to consume content, go and do that sometime today. Catch up on the messages from the last 9 or 10 weeks of this series. They really are foundational. We just work verse by verse through God's word, and it builds on itself. And so we're going to dive back in here. Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Let's read this together. It says, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked them, Who do people say that I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say that I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And so if you've been tracking with us in this series, just back up a little bit for some context. Jesus had done most of his ministry in this Sea of Galilee region. But over the last few months of their kind of ministry, he's taken a little detour. He's gone outside of Israel, and he's gone to some of these kind of outside nations where he's trying to teach the disciples some very specific lessons. Where we left off is they were in this region called the Decapolis. That area was in the southeast kind of corner, southeast of the Sea of Galilee. They are now moving towards a new area, an area called Caesarea Philippi, which is on the complete opposite end of the Sea of Galilee, up in the northeast, right? And so while they're traveling along, right, and these were like, these guys were on foot, right? They didn't have cars. They weren't riding in trains. Like everything they did on foot, right? So there's this long walk, this long journey. And as they're making their way up there, Jesus, as he always does, takes an opportunity to teach his disciples something. And I would argue, in a way, he's giving them a final exam. It is very close. We've talked about this over the last few weeks. We're getting very close to the time when Jesus is actually going to go to the cross and be crucified and do what he came to do ultimately. And in these last couple of months that he's spending with his disciples, he's trying to get them to understand the most important foundational truths of what it means to be his follower. And so he's about to give them here this final exam, and he begins with a question. Who do people say that I am? Now this first question is really just the lead-in to the second question, because he needs to get them to understand something first before he can ask the question he really wants to get answered. He says, who do people say that I am? In other words, he's trying to get them to see that there are going to be many different opinions about who Jesus is. Right? And so what did they do? They began to spout off some of the people that they believe Jesus is. Well, some people say he's John the Baptist. Some people say, Jesus, that you're Elijah. Some people say you're just some other prophet. Right? And the reality is, I just, as we've gone through these Gospels, it just blows my mind. Maybe I'm the only one, but I don't think so. How many times Jesus can reveal himself? Over and over again, miracle after miracle, the amazing teaching that he did, and how many people can still reject Christ? How many people can still walk away from Jesus and not get who he actually is? That he's so much more than just a prophet. We've seen this over and over again, but at the same time, is it really that surprising? Is it really that surprising? The people of his day wanted Jesus to be something that he was not. They wanted him to be this militaristic conqueror, to come in and put Israel back into power, to be the superpower of the world like they once were, to overthrow the Roman government. Right? That's what they were looking for. That's what they wanted. And when Jesus did not meet that expectation, what happened? They walked away. We've now seen this over and over again in the Gospels. They walked away from Jesus. And in the same way, come on, is it any different today? How much more evidence do we need to proclaim to the world around us of the truth of Jesus Christ, who he was, the amount of historical evidence? There's just mounds and mounds of evidence for the gospel, the transformed lives of millions of people. And yet every day, there are people who are walking away from Jesus, who they want one thing from him, and the expectation is one thing. And when they find out what Jesus is really all about, they don't want to have anything to do with him. That breaks my heart. I'm sure that it broke Jesus' heart as he asked this first question, recognizing how many people would walk away. And so he needs them to see this. And so he comes back with a second question, right? What is the second question that he wants them to answer? Who do you say that I am? Who do you say I am? Right? It's one thing to ask the question, what does everybody else believe about me? It's another thing to ask the question, who do you believe I am? In other words, right, it doesn't matter what your parents believe, does it? It doesn't matter what your friends believe. It doesn't matter what your coworkers believe. It only matters at the end of the day what you believe about Jesus. Who do you say that I am? And I just love Peter so much. Peter, honestly, I look at him and sometimes I feel like, man, I'm a lot like Peter. He just shoots his mouth off sometimes. I mean, he just says what he's feeling and he doesn't think sometimes, right? And in this case, it's a really good thing. He just so boldly proclaims, Jesus, you are the Messiah. You are the King. You are the Lord of Lords. You are the Son of God, right? He proclaims that with such boldness. He doesn't hesitate at all. In a moment, we're going to see Peter do this again, only in a negative way. That's the problem with being that kind of a person who just kind of says what's on their mind, right? But they believe, these disciples, they absolutely believe that he is the Messiah, right? And for those whose eyes have been opened to the truth of the gospel, like it's so clear. It's so obvious who he is. It's why I can get up here and talk so passionately about Jesus, because I'm so convinced of who he is and what he has done in my life and what he wants to do in other people's lives, right? These guys are totally and completely convinced. You're the Messiah. And so Jesus, what he's doing here is he's making sure there's absolute clarity, right? We talked about expectations as we began today. There's absolute clarity. There can be no questioning who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. He's leaving absolutely no doubt. Look what he says. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. In other words, you're right. I am the Messiah. It's not my time to go to the cross yet, so I need you to keep it on the DL. But yes, you are right? But Jesus needs them to understand more than that. He needs them to understand way more than just he's the Messiah. First and foremost, he needs them to understand, what does that mean for Jesus? What is that going to mean for him? And so we continue on. He's not done with his teaching yet. It says in verse 31, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And so they've just confirmed, the disciples have just confirmed, Jesus is the Messiah, right? And so Jesus launches into then this statement that would have been, I think for us, it's hard to fathom how shocking it would have been for Jesus to tell them then that he is going to have to suffer and die. Wait a second, what? You just told us you're the Messiah. We just confirmed that, right? You're going to be the one who finally restores everything, who brings Israel back to power and conquers the Romans, and we're going to be sitting at your right and your left, and we're going to be just enjoying this amazing moment of redemption with you. Wait a minute. You're going to suffer and die? That doesn't compute. That doesn't make any sense. How can that possibly be? And so Peter, again, just boldly spouts out. What does he say? It says he rebuked him, right? No, Jesus, no, that's not, no. There's no way you are going to suffer and die. You're the Messiah. We love you. We're not going to let that happen. Right? We care about you. We've followed you around for the last 2.5 years. This can't end this way. Right? This is what is going on in their minds. And before we get too down on Peter for shooting off his mouth, this is the reality. Peter was the spokesperson for the disciples. Everybody else is thinking it. He's just the only one who's bold enough to actually say it, right? They're all thinking the same thing. They love him. They've sacrificed for him. They've come to rely on him, and they're afraid. Come on, wouldn't you be? They're afraid of losing, or they're afraid of losing everything that they've worked for. In the back of their minds, this is the question I imagine they're asking themselves. Will it all be for nothing? All this traveling around and doing the miracles and doing this ministry, and is it all going to be for nothing? I mean, we left our families for this. We left everything to come and to follow you, Jesus. And on the surface, maybe at first this seems a little bit like good motivation, the right heart posture to have, right? They're trying to protect Jesus, and they don't want to see him die. And I think on some level there's some truth to that, but at the end of the day, their motivations are actually super selfish. They're self-centered, and Jesus kind of points that out to them, right? He says, you don't have in mind the concerns of God, but the concerns of man. He tells them that. Like, you don't see the big picture. I mean, how often is this the case in our lives, right? His ways are higher. His thoughts are higher. God understands things that we don't always understand. And right, that's where they're at. They're in this position right now where all they can see, all they can think about is things from a human perspective. And so what does Jesus do? Well, he comes right back at him, doesn't he? He comes back and he rebukes Peter. And he says something that at first glance I read it and I'm like, whoo, that's harsh. He says, get behind me, Satan. I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever called you Satan before, but that's not a great feeling, I don't think. I mean, we're talking about the most evil, wicked being in the history of the world. What we need to understand here is Jesus isn't calling Peter Satan. We know this. Satan hasn't somehow inhabited Peter and all of a sudden he's standing there before Jesus. That's not what's going on here. But we do need to recognize something. Peter is unknowingly, I don't think he realizes, I don't think he understands what he's doing, but he is unknowingly being the mouthpiece of Satan himself. He's trying to dissuade Jesus from going to the cross and fulfilling his mission. And it's what Satan's been doing since the very beginning, isn't it? Let's go back to the beginning, to the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve. Well, what is he trying to do? He's trying to get them to fall, to sin, so that he can destroy them. And then, I'm sure Satan was pretty surprised by this. God doesn't just obliterate humanity like he could have. Now he says, actually, I have a plan to save them through this one that I'm going to call the Messiah. And one day he's going to come and he is going to save the world from their sin. And so finally, little sweet baby Jesus comes, right? Christmas is almost upon us. And what happens? What does Satan do? He orchestrates in Herod's mind a plan, right? Let's go kill all of the little babies under the age of 2. Let's just eliminate this Messiah right now before he can ever grow up and do what God sent him to do. Of course, we know that did not work, right? God's plan cannot be thwarted, right? But Satan has been trying. He's been doing everything he can to kill the Messiah. And now he's trying to do it again. Let's figure out a way, or excuse me, not kill the Messiah, kill the Messiah's plan, right? Let's figure out a way to make sure Jesus doesn't go to the cross. So he's using Peter to do that. In the same way, even though Satan was not able to accomplish that plan, think about today. Think about the world that we live in. Think about how many times people are being used as the mouthpiece, essentially, of Satan. Every single day, there's an evil agenda going on. Satan's number one agenda, his number one scheme is to get people to not believe that Jesus is who he says he is. Satan wants people to believe they can get to heaven through their works-based righteousness. He wants them to believe that all the things that they've ever done, their guilt and their shame, like Jesus could never forgive you, right? Jesus isn't real. He didn't actually walk the earth. He wasn't a real man. He's not God. I mean, we could go on with the lies that Satan is spewing his agenda every single day. nothing has changed, if he can get people to not believe in Jesus, then he wins. And so that's what's going on here in this moment, and why Jesus is so vehemently calling Peter out and saying, no, get behind me, Satan. Your lies aren't going to fly here, my friend, right? I'm going to the cross. It is going to be for your sake and his glory, my glory, right? There's nothing you can do to stop this. Look at what he said. He couldn't have been more clear. He said that he must be killed. He must die. That's what Jesus said. There's no other plan. There's no way around this. This is the way, and it is going to happen. Couldn't have been more clear. And so that's another area here of expectation, of clarity Jesus is bringing to the disciples in this moment. Yes, I am the Messiah, and yes, I have to die. I'm going to have to die and suffer so that you can truly live. Nothing will stop that. And so he's bringing this clarity to them. And again, this has been hard for them to understand. They don't like this. They don't want this. They can't see the big picture, right? And so finally, he needs them to not only understand what Jesus is going to have to go through, what it means for him to be the Messiah, but he needs them to understand ultimately what it means for them. What does it mean for them to follow Jesus, for them to truly put their faith and trust in the Messiah? And this is the one where, man, this week I have been like wrestling with this and chewing on this. This is so convicting. And yet at the same time, I've been so encouraged by this. Let's read this together. Look at what he says. It says, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples. And he said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. I want to read that again. That is a heavy, heavy statement. That should make us go, whoa, what? Look at this. He says he called the crowd to him, and along with the disciples, he said, whoever wants to be my disciple, if you want to follow me, he says, you must deny yourself, and you must take up your own cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life is ultimately going to lose it. And whoever loses their life for my sake and for the gospel will actually save it. Jesus he's throwing down the gauntlet here. He is drawing a distinct line in the sand. If you want to be my follower, he says, if you really want to be my disciple, there are three things that you are going to have to do. First and foremost, he says it in the front end of this and the back end of this. If you want to follow me, this is what it looks like, right? We are called to follow Jesus. He is not just our Savior, he is Lord of our life. He is the King of our lives. And we are called to follow him. I love this Greek word here, akaluthio. It's the word that means follow, and it's best described as obedient sheep. That's the best way to describe it. Somebody who is an obedient sheep, akaluthio, right? That's what he's calling us to, every one of us, to be an obedient sheep. We all know what sheep are like, right? Right? They need led. Right? And if they don't follow the shepherd, what happens? They get off course. They get in places where there's no food, no water. They get in places where there's prey that will attack them. Right? He says, no. No, if you're going to be my follower, you need to follow me obediently. Go wherever I go, whatever I ask you to do, whatever direction I head, you are going to stay with me. You're not going to stray from me no matter what. And so the question then becomes, well, what does that look like? Well, Jesus gives us the answer here, right? What does it mean to actually follow him? Well, first and foremost, what does he say? He says, you take up your cross. And this is where it gets really heavy. Take up your cross, Jesus tells them. Now, I would imagine most of us, all of us, have never actually witnessed a crucifixion, right? That's not something that's done anymore. But in those days, make no mistake about it, these guys have seen it. They have witnessed it. They know the agony, the suffering, the shame that comes along with somebody going to the cross. They have watched people carry their cross up the hill of Golgotha to the top of the hill and be nailed to that piece of wood. They've seen it. They've felt the emotion of it. And so when Jesus says to them, take up your cross, you want to follow me? You're going to have to take up your cross. Man, the emotions would have just begun to just overflow. What? What are you talking about? That's insane. I don't want to do that, right? Like, how many of us would in the same position would be thinking the same thing? This is crazy. This is insane, right? And so I want to just talk about what that actually means for us, right? Many of the disciples were martyred. There have been many Christians over the years who have been martyred. I would argue most of us, that will probably not be the fate that we meet. Right? And so he's not being literal here, although for some people it is literal. What he's absolutely saying, though, is, are you willing to go through the same things that I'm going to go through on the cross for the sake of the gospel? Are you willing to do that? Right? First of all, I want to give you 4 things that kind of fall under the category of taking up our cross. First of all, are you willing to be opposed by the world? Are you willing to face opposition day in and day out from the culture, from the world that we live in that is constantly just screaming out, crying out, you believe in Jesus? You go to church regularly? You try to live these principles in this ancient book called the Bible? What are you, crazy? Right? I mean, every one of us at some point has felt that opposition if we have actually proclaimed the gospel through our words and through our living in this world. Right, so we got to be willing to be opposed. You want to take up your cross? If you're not willing to be opposed, you can't. Not only that, but we have to be willing to be shamed. Like the cross was the most shameful way that a person could be treated in that day. They were stripped naked, beaten within an inch of their life, and then hung up on a cross for everybody to see, to be mocked and ridiculed and spit on. They put a sign over their heads mocking them, right? They did that to Jesus. It was unbelievably shameful to have to go through that. Jesus is saying, are we willing, for the sake of the gospel, to go through that same kind of shame? For what we believe, for what we preach, for how we live? Are we willing to do that? That's taking up our cross, right? Not only that, are we willing to suffer? That's the third one. Man, there was no greater suffering that a person could go through. There was no more difficult way that a person could be executed than to go to the cross. Just the agony. Some people, it took days and days for people to die. It was an awful, awful way. Just complete and total suffering as you died on a cross. Are we willing, again, metaphorically, to suffer no matter what it takes for the gospel to be made known, for Jesus' name to be made famous? That's what it means to take up our cross. And ultimately, the final one is, are we willing to die for the sake of the gospel? And again, while many of us will never have to face that fate, are we willing to? Can we really sit here and say, you know what? If it came down to it, yes, I would be willing. I think back, I came of age in the 1990s. I was a teenager in the 90s, graduated in 2001. And in 1998, there was a really kind of catastrophic event that happened in our country, Columbine. I don't know if you guys, some of you may remember this, some of you don't. It was really the first kind of school shooting that I remember. And there was a young woman who these guys came up to with a gun in hand, pointed it at her face and said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" She said, "Yes, I do." And they took her life. And I never forgot that moment. Because to me, while I will probably never be faced with that, my question in the back of my mind was, would I be willing to say that? Would I be willing to do that? I absolutely want to believe that I would, that no matter what I recognize, this life is short, this life is fleeting, and I believe in my Savior Jesus enough that I'd be willing to die for the sake of the gospel. That's what taking up your cross looks like. Are we willing to be opposed, to be shamed, to suffer, and ultimately, if it would come to it, are we willing to die for the sake of the gospel? It's heavy. And yet this is the expectation that Jesus places here on his disciples. Now, finally, I want to unpack this for a second. In order to take up our cross, we are going to have to do something. There is a mindset that you have to have in order to do that, because that is, boy, what a challenge. Jesus gives a preface to that taking up your cross mantra. What does he say? He says, you're going to have to deny yourself. He says, deny yourself and take up your cross. So I want to talk about for a second what that means. Because, boy, we are living in a world, people do not like to deny themselves, do they? We are living in a world where it's just indulgent, and we don't even like giving up a Starbucks coffee, let alone really, truly denying ourselves in big and kind of sacrificial ways, if we're really honest with ourselves. Right? Jesus says, you cannot take up your cross if you do not first deny yourself. Those two things go hand in hand. You cannot separate those two things. Here's another Greek word. It's the word apernomai. Apernomai. It's the word for deny. The imagery here is to completely disown. So in other words, we are to what? Deny, to completely disown what? Ourselves. We are to completely disown ourselves. And that is just not in our flesh human nature, is it? Right? What does it mean to disown something? Right? To disown something, you say, I don't want to be anywhere near you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. Jesus says we're to do that to ourselves. Our desires, the things that we want, our selfish needs, all those things, he says, you need to disown yourself from those things because you can't take up your cross if you are still clinging to all of those selfish pleasures and desires that you want for yourself. And so again, what does that look like? What are some of those kind of self-centered things that we cling to that we're going to have to let go of? I want to give you, again, 4, and these kind of line up with those things that we talked about when it comes to taking up the cross, taking up our cross. First of all, right, we're going to be opposed. We're going to constantly be opposed. And you know what that's going to fight against? Us wanting to be accepted. That's what it's going to fight against, right? And so denying ourselves means giving up acceptance in this world if it's necessary. I'm okay not being accepted by the world if it means that I get to continue to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm okay with that. Not only that, but right, if we're being shamed, right, if taking up our cross means being willing to be shamed, right, then it's giving up our own glory. Isn't it? Right, what's the opposite of that? Right, it's glory, right? We want glory for ourselves, don't we? We're glory hounds. Human beings are. I want people to look at me and see how great I am and look at all the cool things I've done and the amazing things I've done. Look how smart I am. Look at all the things I've accomplished, right? I want the glory on me. We have to deny that. We have to disown ourselves from that and say, no. Everything from this point forward is about Jesus Christ getting the glory. Everything I have, everything I own, I want everybody to look at me and go, wow, look how amazing Jesus is. Now look how amazing I am. Right? To disown ourselves from that, right? It means giving up comfort. Right? To take up our cross is to be willing to suffer, which means we're going to have to give up the comforts of this life sometimes. We love being comfortable, don't we? We just do. We want to be comfortable. It's, again, just as part of our nature. Right? I don't want to be put in situations that make me uncomfortable. I don't want to have to give things up that might make me uncomfortable. And yet this is exactly what Jesus calls us to. He says you got to be willing to give up your comfort. And then finally, right? If the ultimate sign of taking up your cross is death ultimately, then the thing we must give up is our security, our safety, maybe is a better way to put it. Right? Again, don't we all want that so badly? We just cling to security and safety in this life. Think about the billions and trillions of dollars that are spent every single year on the health and fitness industry so that we can try to have some sense of control over our security and our safety. We just go to the nth degree to make sure we're secure and to make sure that we are safe. Right, Jesus says, you're going to have to give that up. If you really want to be my follower, if you want to be my disciple, you're going to have to lay that down and be okay with not being safe, with not being secure sometimes. This is what it means to take up our cross. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're all going to lose our life for the sake of the gospel. It might not even mean that every one of us has to sell everything we have and go be a missionary in some other country. But it does absolutely mean that we are willing, this is the key, we are willing to go wherever he sends us. We are willing to stand for the truth of the gospel no matter what the opposition and the pushback. We are willing to be shamed because we recognize nothing is more important than people knowing Jesus. This is what he's called us to. Now, you might be sitting here thinking, wow, you're really selling Christianity today. This sounds like a great life. Sacrifice everything I have, give away everything I have, be willing to suffer, be willing to be shamed. That sounds fantastic, right? But the reality is, and this is what I want you to see today, man, we live in a world, a kind of a church culture, Christian culture, where I just feel like there's such a lie being told that it's pervasive in our world. That if you follow Jesus, everything is going to be so great for you all the time. You're going to be wealthy. You're going to have prosperity in every way. You're going to be healthy. Good things are going to happen to you, man. It's going to be rainbows and butterflies all the time. Are we reading the same Bible here? I'm reading that and I'm going, that sounds like the opposite of what Jesus is saying here. It sounds like the exact opposite of that. But at the same time, there is an amazing reward for following Jesus and being willing to take up our cross. And I think those of us who have been following Jesus for a while now recognize the amazing gift, the rewards, the inheritance that Jesus has promised us, the joy, the peace, the satisfaction, the purpose that we receive as we take up our cross is far greater and better than anything that this world has to offer. And so while Jesus calls us to take up our cross, he says, here's what you need to do. Make no mistake about it. He also tells us why and why it is so important for us and why it will be so good for us. And so he doesn't just stop there. I want to read this last part here. Verses 36 to 38. Look at what Jesus says. He doesn't just tell them what to do. He tells them why we should do it. What good is it, he says, for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. What good is it, he says, to gain the whole world, gain everything that this world has to offer, only to, at the end, lose it all? It's a waste. You're wasting your time. It is worthless. And so what he's ultimately saying here is saving ourselves, trying to save ourselves now, trying to be accepted now, trying to gain security now, trying to make sure we don't suffer in any way now, ultimately is going to lead to those things later. And he's saying, don't sacrifice the long-term gains for these short-term gains that are this life is going to be over like that. It's almost Christmas again. I feel like this every year. Oh my gosh, it's almost Christmas again. Oh my gosh, it's almost Christmas again. Do we recognize how fast this life is going to go by? It's just, we are a vapor, as Solomon says, we're a vapor in the wind. We're going to be gone. And then we have an eternity after that, either in heaven or in hell. That's the truth. Like, I don't want to sugarcoat it this morning. Why? Because I love you and I care about you so deeply, and I want you to get this. If we live our lives for this life now, we're going to lose so much more later. That's what Jesus is saying. I love the parable of the man who discovers a treasure in a field. It's found in Matthew chapter 13. He discovers this treasure in a field, and so what does he do? He goes and he sells everything else that he has, all of his worldly possessions, and he comes back and he buys the field with the money he got from selling all of that. And the treasure that he found, the treasure that he gets on that land is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Recognizing that's the true treasure. That's where the good stuff is. It's not all this other stuff. This is what Jesus wants them to see. He's saying, recognize this. Church, recognize this. Obedience and sacrifice and suffering for the sake of the gospel for Jesus leads to a far greater treasure than anything you will find in this world. To the question that I believe those disciples asked, will it be worth it? Was it all worth it to follow Jesus? You better believe it. It's worth it. It's worth all of the shame and the suffering and anything that we might have to go through. What the world offers is empty and temporal. It leads to misery and ultimately to death. And so here's my main point today. Here's the point I believe Jesus is just trying to get across to his disciples, and he's still trying to get across to us 2,000 years later. If you want to truly live, you have to be willing to die. Again, not in the literal sense, although it may come to that, but we have to be willing to die to ourselves, to die to self. That is the only way we truly live. And what he's saying here, again, he's drawing a hard line in the sand. He's saying there is only one way to follow Jesus. It is complete and total surrender to his will over our lives. That's what he calls us to. He does not sugarcoat it. He could not be more clear. The expectation is so unbelievably clear. And this is why I get so fired up, honestly, and angry. A little bit angry when I hear churches preaching a message to people of just health and wealth and prosperity. I'm like, no, that's not what Jesus says. We want everything to be, man-centered. It's all about you. It's all about, what God can do for you. Jesus Christ calls his disciples and his followers to a different way of living. And what's important for us to know today is that the reward for that is actually so much greater than health and wealth and prosperity in this life. And that is it's just such a hard concept for us to latch onto and grab onto. And yet, man, I want that for you today. He could not have been more clear. Take up your cross, he says. Take up your cross. Deny yourself. There's a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There's actually a movie coming out about him here real soon. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor and theologian during the Holocaust and World War II, saved a whole bunch of Jews from the Holocaust, and ultimately lost his own life fighting for that, proclaiming the gospel, being willing to be opposed and shamed. Listen to what he said before he died. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. He bids him come and die. Right? He's, I believe, looking directly at this scripture. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's looking at this. Mark 8, 27 to 38. And he's going, that's what I see. That's what I see my Savior calling me to come and to lay down my life for the sake of the gospel. At the end of the day, church, we can say all we want. Yeah, I follow Jesus. I love Jesus. I'm all in on this Jesus thing. But if we are not willing to lay everything down for the sake of the gospel, then we're not doing what he's called us to do. And so I want to end with just some very practical things here. This is a heavy message. You may be feeling extremely convicted right now. And honestly, I hope you are. I do. I hope you are. Because that conviction is what will actually lead you to a greater life. It will. It will lead you to the joy, peace, satisfaction, contentment, and purpose that you actually are searching for in all those other things. But I also want you to feel encouraged this morning, because some of us might be reading that and go, what do I do with that? Thanks, Justin. That's great, but what am I supposed to do with that? How does that apply to my life? How do I figure that out? And it's going to be different for every single person in this room. I wasn't called to be a missionary. That's not how God called me to lay down my life. He called me to be a local church pastor. For some of you, he may be calling you to just live this out wherever you work, wherever your neighborhood is. How are you living this out, right? It's going to look different for everybody, but there's one principle that we can absolutely take away this morning that I think will help frame this for us. It's Matthew 6:33. It's one of my favorite verses. It simply says, seek first his kingdom. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you as well. It comes on the heels of Jesus talking about how people are worried about all kinds of different things in this life, and we need to trust him, right? And then he says, seek first his kingdom. Seek first his kingdom. Seek first his kingdom. If we will stop seeking first to build our kingdom, to do what we want, right? Deny self, and we will begin to simply seek first his kingdom, to build his kingdom, to make his name famous in everything that we do, willing to sacrifice all of our resources if necessary to make his name famous. That is what it looks like to take up your cross. And so I want to end with this today. That's for my church people. If you are a follower of Jesus, he has saved you. He has redeemed you. Ultimately, we owe him everything. We're not saved because of the things that we do. We're not going to be saved because of the way we took up our cross. Please hear that today. That's so important. The gospel says we are sinners. If we will repent and put our faith and trust in him, he will save us, and it is finished, and there's nothing that can ever change that in our lives. Maybe somebody today just needs to hear that. Yes, Jesus calls us to this. That is a challenge. Boy, the challenge of challenges. But the very first thing he calls you to is just to simply receive the cross that he bore for you. But yes, he says take up your cross, but man, the first step is you got to let him take it up for you. He already has. He's just waiting for you to say, okay, I see what you did there, Jesus, and I'm ready. And from this point forward, I give you my life. I submit to your authority in my life, and I am going to do everything I can to serve you with the days that I have left. Man, that's my prayer for us as a church. That we would be the kind of church that in our world, people recognize, people know, wow, those people deny themselves daily. Look at the way they're taking up their cross, and look at the impact they're having for the gospel on the world around them.